Hello and welcome back to Film Theory's lecture series online. Today I'm going to move on to the next chapter, which concerns psychoanalytic film theory. There are a number of reasons why we consider psychoanalysis and film kind of natural allies. One of them being that they were born around the very same time. If you remember the date, 1895, that's when the Lumiere brothers first presented their films in Paris, and that's the year when Sigmund Freud first published his psychoanalytic papers. Another similarity or parallel is that for many, dreams play out just like film sequences, so there's the similarity there as well. And the third one, more academically grounded, is that in the 1960s and 70s, when theorists started to seriously tackle film as an academic project, psychoanalysis was really in. It was really a post-structuralist flagship. So it was an easy ally, again, to study films according to psychoanalytic film theory. Now, there's a problem here, we might say, because Sigmund Freud himself actually hated movies. He thought that they were childish, they were useless, so basically he refused to work with filmmakers when he was approached to create kind of a faithful dream sequence for a film. Later on, however, psychoanalysis and film production met without Freud. Of course, this was the production of Georg Wilhelm Pabst's Secrets of a Soul. The sequence is constructed thematically and structurally as a dream with the help of professional psychoanalysts. Now, when we talk about psychoanalytic film theory, basically this is not one theory. There are 5 main approaches that we can distinguish among in this tendency. The first one being the so-called cultural myth analysis. The second one is kind of a biographical analysis, where we use the filmmaker's biography to explain the film. Then we have character analysis, where we obviously explain the motives and the unconscious impulses of the character. Then we have spectatorship. And the last one, probably the most widely used one, is the analog model. Today I'm going to talk about the first two, that is the cultural myth analysis and using the biography of the filmmaker to understand and interpret the film. Now, when we talk about cultural myth analysis, of course the first question that pops into our minds is, what kind of myths are we talking about? Now, certainly not the type of myths or mythologies that try and explain how the world came to be and explain the position of the subject in this world. What we are talking about here is rather the myths surrounding films and the myths emerging through the films themselves. Talking about the myths surrounding the films, basically we are talking about the working of the film industry. Because if you think about the star industry, celebrities, celebrity tabloids, behind the scenes programs, basically these build up expectations and these build up some kind of a knowledge of the film beyond the film. You have expectations and you already have some knowledge about the film. You know the stars, you know basically how the movie was made before you get to watch the movie. This creates a kind of a myth that surrounds that film. The other consideration here is the myth that emerges through the film or through several films. Here, basically think about, for example, a genre, Western. Western is a myth, not on its own right, but how the film industry developed it into a kind of a national myth for the US. The origin of this approach is based in cultural analysis, and the name you need to remember here is Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was the first to analyze how culture works in structural patterns, and he comes to the conclusion that each and every culture has a kind of deep structure in which it organizes binary oppositions which then govern the working of that society. This cultural approach can help us analyze how our societies respond to the returns of the socially repressed binaries, and films are perfectly fit for this enterprise because they negotiate this process as they present pivotal conflicts, pivotal binary oppositions, and represent issues as fantasies. And fantasy is one of the number one occupations of psychoanalytic approaches. Cultural myth analysis can be useful in other ways as well. If you think about how changes in our societies occur and how they are represented in different cultural forms, film also reflects on these changes, and analyzing these kinds of changes in representation, in characters, in storylines can lead to deep insight into how those binaries that Claude Lévi-Strauss was talking about, how they are developing and how they are changing society, by the way. Think about the career of the actor Clint Eastwood, for example. His screen persona started out as a hyper-masculine representation, which was fit for the 60s and 70s. Think about Dirty Harry, think about the cowboy figures. And then he moves on to a more passionate, emotional, so to speak, softer kind of representation of masculinity. Think about The Bridges of Madison County, for example. So his career basically parallels cultural changes that occurred from the late 60s onwards towards the 90s and even on into the 21st century. All right, the next approach that I'm going to talk about today is using the filmmaker's biography as a kind of a trampoline for analyzing and understanding their films. This concerns the knowledge and the reading of the filmmaker's life in the form of biography so that we can uncover traumas, childhood problems, motives in their lives, and we can use them to explain the motives and the workings of characters and narratives in their oeuvre. A nice example of this is the legend that concerns Alfred Hitchcock. It's alleged that little Hitchcock was sent to the nearby police station by his father with a note to the chief officer that he should lock up little Hitchcock in a cell because he misbehaved. Now, many film theorists and critics explain the ambiguous representation of policemen in Hitchcock's films, for example, based on this anecdote, saying that because he had this childhood trauma of being locked up in the police cell caused him to form an ambivalent representation, an ambivalent relationship with the police force. There are two main problems with this approach, actually. One is that film is a communal product. So how can we narrow it down to the biography and life and childhood traumas of one single person? The other is that biography is always already a kind of a story. It's a narrative. Now, how can you use a narrative, a fiction basically, to explain other narratives and other fictions? Nonetheless, this approach remains quite popular with critics, probably because it somehow feeds into the myth that surrounds films and the myth that might be said to be emerging through films. Thank you very much for your attention. Next time I'm coming up with another two approaches, that is character analysis and the issue of spectatorship from a psychoanalytic point of view. Stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.